the real point is that it's not efficiency of the agencies, it's elimination of the agencies that we want to have happen. We want to roll this thing back in that sense. Every one of those things that isn't initially absolute, start off with absolute necessity. Is it absolutely necessary? No, it goes. And then we'll work our way down.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty in Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for November 18th through November 25th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature backdated 1-ounce silver Austrian Philharmonics at just $3.09 over spot per ounce. We also feature the limited edition 2024 1-ounce gold UK Lion and Eagle coin at just $99 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah K. Johnson with Liberty in Finance, and back with us today is renowned constitutional attorney Dr. Edwin Vieira, who has argued cases up to including the Supreme Court. He is also an expert in sound money and has talked to us previously regarding the many hurdles of Trump regaining power here. I remember in a previous interview you did with my father, you mentioned how, if Trump can get through all these hurdles, the assassination attempts, the lawfare, the whole media being turned against him, questionable things in the electoral process and everything, that it would be a miracle if he came through. So I wanted to get your perspective now that Trump is elected and is going to be the 27th president, God willing, that we make it through these next couple months here, a month and a half. Your perspective on this whole process that has transpired.
There certainly was a great deal of dissatisfaction in the country with respect to the Biden-Harris administration. Particularly, you could see that because of the vast media mainstream media attacks against Trump, which had no effect. People weren't paying attention to that source of information, misinformation, however you want to categorize it, which has had a dominant role in the past. And the pundits and pollsters, to a very large degree, even if they were predicting a Trump victory, were predicting it by a very, very narrow margin and always hedging their bets by saying, well, things can go one way or the other, plus or minus a percentage, as they usually do. And how did it turn out? Well, it turned out to be a landslide in every respect. Popular vote, electoral vote, swing states, all of those categories, which are indicia of real public opinion shift, moved in Trump's direction. So here he is again, but he's not inaugurated yet. There is that hurdle to get over. He had some lingering problems with certainly the particular case in which he was convicted, supposedly, of whatever number of so-called felonies in New York. That has all sorts of legal problems in it, but those problems won't be resolved until eventually it gets up to the appellate level, in either in New York or at the Supreme Court level, probably both, would be my guess. So there's something that's hanging over him in one way or another. And then there are other problems because there are entrenched forces within the so-called deep state, which will be doing everything possible to sabotage or at least throw roadblocks or gum up the mechanisms that he would have to use to make any fundamental changes in the way Washington, D.C. operates. And I don't know whether he is, or his transition team people are really prepared for that, because they can't necessarily determine what those hurdles will be that will be put in their path. I mean, take an example right now of the way the Biden administration has essentially flip-flopped over its policy with respect to not simply arming the Ukrainians, the Zelensky regime, with long-range missiles, but authorizing in one way or another those missiles to be used for targets inside of Russia proper. it was going to be a no-go in the past, and now it's, well, maybe open to all possibilities. And, of course, that led to Putin's declaration of a new nuclear warfare policy, and then his Russians' employment of what they say are new hypersonic missiles just the other day. And where that will lead, we don't know. That looks like a sabotage operation on behalf of the outgoing Biden administration to leave Trump with maybe not an irreconcilable mess, but a very difficult one to resolve as soon as he gets in. And he'll have, what should I say, impediments coming out of the Pentagon over that, probably also coming out of the entrenched bureaucracy in the State Department. So we'll have some difficulties with forces that are now, let's say, in control one way or the other, at least behind the scenes in those agencies, intelligence agencies, for instance, CIA, NSA, that have their own agenda. And that's a problem, because he can put people in at the top levels, but it's the intermediate and, to a certain extent, even the lower levels in those agencies that make policy by controlling policy, if you know what I mean, or controlling the implementation of policy. So how he's going to straighten those levels out is strikes me as a problematical situation. Then, of course, he's following his old personality fault of bluster and hyperbolic pronouncements and promises and so forth. He's going to end the Ukrainian situation one day. Well, that's because nonsense on his face. Why does he even need to say that? It's enough to say that he's going to seriously pursue negotiations with the Russians and leave it at that. And we'll see what happens, but not giving promises that are, for all intents and purposes, impossible to fulfill. And then he's already blundered in terms of selecting at least one of his proposed cabinet appointments, Gripes, who had to bow out. Now he's been replaced by the former Attorney General of, maybe she's still Attorney General of Florida. We'll see where that goes. And then the other fellow, Hegseth, people opposing him, they're already raising the kind of the standard sexual peccadillo charges, which can't be proven one way or the other, but they can be hurled at a potential candidate or person who is proposed for an administrative agency position. So all that will go on. We've seen that in the past, and how that gums up the works and creates problems within this case, within the Senate, trying to create divisions between the rhinos and the quote-unquote MAGA Republicans over appointments of this person or that person. And, of course, the Democrats will be, as usual, in the negative on that. So he has a number of problems there, just as practical problems of political manipulation, political administration. And then he's appointing people. Leave Hegseth out of this, because we have the question of whether he'll have to drop out because of these. I mean, these are the kind of charges went on all the way back to, if you recall, Justice Thomas, right? The Anita Hill charges of sexual harassment when Thomas was being considered for appointment to the Supreme Court. So this technique that the Democrats have used is of long standing, and in many instances it has had significant effect. But then he's put people, pronounced people such as Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence. Well, she's a nice woman, and I'm sure she has some sound grasp of certain matters, but I wonder whether she's had any really administrative role that would fit in with what she needs to do in that particular administration. There's another kind of problem. You take the Defense Department, Hegseth. What administrative capability had he ever shown? I mean, there's a department, Pentagon, admitting they're $7 trillion they can't account for over how many years? And that's one of the major things I would think Trump would want to come in and correct immediately, be able to establish the accounting validity, at least, of the budgetary process in the Defense Department. What does Hegseth know about that? Probably zero. Now, a fellow like McNamara certainly had that kind of competence, but then he began moving off into the realm of strategic decisions and advising Johnson about which bridges in North Vietnam were going to be attacked, which was certainly outside of his area of expertise. So that's a kind of difficult problem. You bring people in who have expertise in one area, but the particular position they're in demands also expertise in another area, which they don't have. And who knows? I mean, I look at Trump, I just wonder how he's picking these people. I can understand Robert Kennedy Jr. Being selected for Health and Human Services because of his background in that area. But I wonder whether it would have been better to put him in a position where he had more hands-on control over policy implementation as opposed to the very high-level kind of administrative decisions that the department head is called upon to make. So all sorts of problems there. We don't know what's going to happen, what kind of a quote-unquote team he's going to put together. It also strikes me that he has Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk lined up for this new Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, right, the head of the Venetian government in the Renaissance, the new DOGE. Is that really the problem? Is the problem of the United States government one of efficiency, one of over-bureaucratization, one of wastage in terms of funding, inefficiency in terms of time allocation, what have you, that the thing is just bloated in terms of personnel and consumption of funds? Or is it that in many instances, these agencies, or large parts of them, are just purely unconstitutional? There is no real constitutional role for some of these agencies or some of the activities in which they're engaged. I think immediately the Department of Education. One wonders precisely where in the Constitution there's an authorization for a Department of Education. Think about education in this country, it's all done, other than the service academies, it's all done at the local or state level. The town, the city, the county, the school boards. You might have a state board of education. You might have local state colleges or private institutions of that nature. And they're all located, operated, and regulated, perhaps created, generally public schooling created from the ground floor up as a matter of state law, state regulation, operation within a particular state, within a particular town. So we're not talking about something that could be in some manner of speaking linked to interstate commerce among the several states. He says, well, it's a commercial regulation by Congress. What's the basis of it? Well, the basis of it is very simple. You go back to the Jimmy Carter election, National Education Association, which, along with the American Federation of Teachers, has gutted the value of American education, certainly in the secondary schools. They came to Jimmy Carter in that election and said, this is the first time the NEA has ever endorsed a presidential candidate, and we will endorse you and put all of our resources behind you, political action committees, propaganda, and so forth and so on, public relations, if you will, if you promise to give us a Department of Education. That was the deal. There's a political deal that Carter made with the NEA in order to obtain the NEA support. And I think he probably would have gotten the NEA support even if he hadn't promised to give them the Department of Education. But that was the deal. That's where it came from. It was a political payoff. And you ask, well, where's the basis for it? Or what's the basis for it constitutionally? And my answer is zero. Now, some people would say, well, Congress can spend money for the public good, and this is an expenditure of money, and they need to regulate that expenditure of money. And that harkens back to an erroneous Supreme Court decision that said basically, if Congress can spend money, when Congress spends money on some subject, it can attach conditions to the funding, which would go beyond an actual power of Congress to impose directly. So we have this strings attached concept. And that's a fascinating one because obviously erroneous. If Congress can spend money on anything it wants, and it can attach any strings, no matter how unconstitutional those strings might be if they were attempted to be imposed initially by themselves, then you have an unlimited government by hypothesis, because there's no limit on taxation. to get the funding. And the way the Supreme Court has never handled the matter, but the way Congress has handled the matter through the Federal Reserve System, there's no limit on inflation. That is the expansion of the money supply, creation of more and more government debt. So with taxes and expansion of the money supply, you have infinite flow, potentially at least, of nominal dollars to Congress. And as Congress can spend those on anything it wants in the public interest, which I guess is one of the theories the Supreme Court has been willing to at least tacitly accept. And then Congress can attach any conditions it wants to the spending and receipt of that money at any level of society. Then you have, by hypothesis, a totalitarian government. So is Trump going to, Vivek Ramaswamy or Elon Musk going to look at that? And I haven't seen anything coming out of the propaganda mills of the Trump team that would suggest they're going to look at anything more than pure bureaucratic, corporate management type efficiency. You have too many people doing this job. Let's cut these people. They're spending too much money. Let's cut the funding, whatever. Let's redirect the particular activity in a more efficacious way. But that has nothing to do with whether the activity is itself constitutionally legitimate. Shouldn't be done by the federal government. Could be done by the states. Might not be entitled to be done at all. Interesting question. You have a lot of things that the federal government is supposedly doing, which the states couldn't do at all. That's the argument that's often made. Oh, well, the states can't do this, so we need the federal government to do it. Well, the question is, can the federal government do it? I mean, there's some things government isn't supposed to do. So he isn't looking into that. And then there is, of course, a big question that he seems to be willing to be more accepting of military or, near-military solutions with respect to the Middle East than he is with respect to Ukraine, and I suppose that's at least half right. But nonetheless, the Middle Eastern situation potentially ties the United States into a world conflict, because not only do you have Israel and the Palestinians and the Lebanese and the Syrians, but the Iranians, and the Iranians, of course, have relationships of a defense nature with the Russians and strong relationships of an economic nature with the Chinese, and on we go. So anything that happens in the Middle East potentially has worldwide World War III, put that in quotation, World War III possibilities attached to it, perhaps even more so than the situation with Ukraine, because that war, at least in military terms, seems to be winding down to the detriment of the Ukrainians. That may fizzle out. It's kind of left alone on the back burner, but what's going on in the Middle East probably will not for some time. And Trump seems to be more inclined for real American intervention or support, at least of Israel, in the Middle East than he does for intervention or support of the Zelensky regime in Europe. So you don't know which way he's going to go on that. And some of his advisors or supporters, people who are within or kind of on the periphery of the Trump transition apparatus, seem to be very much for military intervention, maybe in both of those theaters, or at least in the Middle East, given Trump's recognition and their recognition as Israel is his great, strongest ally, or whatever. We have this special relationship with Israel. So we don't know where that's going to go. Then he has the problem, of course, with the national economy, and federal spending is obviously one goad to that difficulty, but federal spending really is dependent upon the banking system, Federal Reserve System. Federal Reserve System is the ultimate bail, the ultimate inflationary mechanism. Well, what's he going to do with the Federal Reserve System? There was a talk about replacing the chairman of the Board of Governors, and the chairman of the Board of Governors says, well, he can't be replaced, can't be removed. And of course, if you read the statute, that's not true. Any member of the Board of Governors can be removed by the president for cause. But what is cause? Is the policy of the Federal Reserve that's resulting in high levels of what people call inflation, like price increases. Is that cause? That would be incompetence. Is that a cause? Is it cause that the Federal Reserve is not in any way seriously providing for its requirements under the Humphrey-Hawkins Act? One of the requirements being stability in prices, that is, no inflationary events, serious inflationary events. Certainly not doing that. So one could say, well, maybe that's a cause for removing this man, that he's the chairman of the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors is not complying with the Humphrey-Hawkins Act. So it's not simply a matter that he's not complying potentially with Trump's policies, but there's a statute of Congress that says he should be doing this, or the board should be doing this, and he's not doing it. So let's remove him. So that's another problem. Politically, what would happen there if he takes on the banking system? Actually, if he would take on the banking system, if he looks at Title 12 of the United States Code, which is the section of the code that deals with the Federal Reserve and the banks, Title 12, Section 95A, okay, which is a holdover from the Roosevelt era, Franklin Roosevelt era. That gives the president the power to control the banks and set the policy for the banks through the Secretary of the Treasury, whoever that might be, and that would be a Trump man, obviously, in any way he deems necessary, and has fantastically severe penalties for bankers who do not comply with these regulations, whatever they might be, coming out of the Secretary of the Treasury. So that's kind of a sort of Damocles that he can hold over the head of the bankers, that if they don't comply, and that's including the Board of Governors, for heaven's sake, then here's the statutory power for him to take what they like to call a kind of emergency power situation, emergency action by the executive. And it was given to Roosevelt, of course, in the early 30s because everyone was screaming, there was an emergency, there's an emergency, I have to give all power to the president. Well, they did. And it's still there. So he has that. I don't know whether he knows about that. No one seems to have mentioned that. But I would think if I were president of the United States and I were having a problem with the Board of Governors, et cetera, so I'd call them all in for a luncheon, and sitting there next to the menu would be a copy of Title 12 of the United States Code, Section 95A, which they could read while they were deciding whether they wanted consomme or turtle soup as their, part of their appetizer. And then we could talk about the banking system over dessert. But he hasn't, we had no one there suggesting that there could be a way. Maybe that's good. Maybe it's wise for Trump to keep his mouth shut entirely about what he might do with respect to the banks, because he does tend to shoot his mouth off too often and telegraph his moves and give his opponents time to develop new tactics and strategies to try and thwart his activities or his goals. So there's the banking system. And then, of course, we do have the problem of immigration, illegal immigration, and how that's going to be handled. And he's making talk about putting the army into the deportation or rounding up, whatever you want to call it, of the illegal aliens. That's an interesting question there, is whether the Posse Comitatus Act actually prevents that from happening, because that would be the army attempting to enforce regular statutory law, and whether he could do that through the National Guard. And that's another question, because when the National Guard is federalized, it actually is part of the Army. It's always part of the Army, but definitely it's part of the Army at that point in time. So maybe the National Guard couldn't do it. Could he call upon the state militias? Well, he obviously could do that, because the Constitution makes him commander-in-chief of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. That's actually the first power of the president in the Constitution. And the militia can be called forth to execute the laws of the Union. Well, the immigration laws are laws of the Union, so he could call forth the militia. And that's what number of people? Millions, potentially millions of people from the 50 states. I did a calculation a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, in Virginia, the so-called unorganized militia. That's what the statute calls them. That's basically everyone that's not in the National Guard. And those people, 16 to 55 years of age, they can be called up by the governor for Virginia, all sorts of Virginia purposes, including invasion, which this immigration problem amounts to, actually. Well, there's 4 million of them. So Trump could come up with some kind of executive order specifying what kind of people he wanted. And imagine he could call upon volunteers at a minimum, or he could call upon the governors to draft these people. In Virginia, the governor has the power to draft people out of the unorganized militia. And if they don't show up, then they're subject to court-martial. Most people that I'd run across in Virginia, I tell this dude, have no idea that this actually exists, but it's there. So that would be one way of dealing with it. You get a heck of a lot of people, especially in the border states. And of course, we talk about the border states. They're on the northern border as well as the southern border, for heaven's sakes now. I'm sure he could muster large numbers of quote-unquote volunteers. I mean, there are certain expenses and so forth would be paid, so they wouldn't be funding their own activity. But I'm sure there are a lot of people who would be capable and willing of performing various functions related to immigration, subject to training and direction by the immigration people themselves, because they have obviously the greatest expertise and experience. But you'd flesh out those immigration border patrol people with large numbers of militia, and that would solve the personnel problem constitutionally, because it wouldn't raise the question of using the regular army or the National Guard seconded to the army for purposes of regular law enforcement, which is highly questionable legally. So I haven't heard him talking about that, but probably the reason is that nobody around him knows anything about it. And so, or maybe they would say, oh, well, if we start talking about this, the mainstream media and the anti-Trump people will take off on the word militia, which has been given an unfortunately bad connotation by the anti-constitutionalists, let's put it that way, in this country. But there's another area. So those three are the big ones. There's the foreign policy problem, because that could lead to a debacle. Remember, it was one man, Gavrilo Princip, who shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. And what eventuated from that? First World War, millions of people killed, the eradication of the political stability in Europe, and then, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and everything that followed from that, including the rise of Hitler and the Second World War and communist China, and on we go. And it all goes back to that one Serbian assassin. So these things do have a tendency to get out of hand. Anyone who says it can't happen only has to go back and look at Mr. Princip and that assassination and what followed. Precisely, it was not simply that he assassinated those two, the royal family, Austria-Hungary, but then there was the incompetence of the various leaders in foreign policy officials in all of the Western countries, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Germany, France, England. They all blundered in one way or another, leading to that catastrophe. So we're looking now at a situation where the Biden administration, Biden is not in control of anything, and certainly Harris is not. So who's in control? We don't know. So there were shadowy figures behind the scenes making decisions based on what kind of imperatives or personal proclivities they may have. And to a certain extent, that's being driven by animosity to Trump, trying to leave a mess on the floor for Trump to clean up. And that's bad enough. But on the Russian side, they're looking at this and saying, well, we're dealing with not simply incompetence in the administration, but really the Biden administration, but really malevolent people. And so we have to assume the worst. Well, I guess Putin was assuming the worst the other day when they launched those new hypersonic missiles and sending a strong signal. And I would take that signal fairly seriously, but God knows what they're doing in the White House. So Trump faces all these problems, and I think the main one from kind of a practical point of view, he should keep his mouth shut. He doesn't want to be telegraphing what he's going to do, especially when he does something such as appointing Gertz or Hegseth, because Hegseth is now being attacked for alleged sexual peccadillos in his past. So these people can be made the subject of constant innuendo and character assassination and what have you by the Democrats. Now just keep quiet about it. I mean, Kennedy was an obvious one, and Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy with respect to the efficiency agency they're going to create. Okay, that's an obvious one. I don't know how much criticism you can make of that concept, or maybe of those two people. And even Tulsi Gabbard, well, I guess you can say she didn't have any experience, but then again, some people grow into a position. I think her real problem will be she can't trust anyone lower down in the bureaucratic structure. She won't know who those people are, and to what extent they're competent, what extent they can be actually loyal to whatever the Trump program is with respect to what shall I say, the restructuring of the intelligence agencies. So we don't know. And then, of course, there's the Department of Justice problem. What I would say is a really big problem is he going to go after whoever he puts in the Department of Justice? Is Trump and his people, are they going to go after the individual and groups that engaged in political sabotage of Trump's first administration and then Trump personally to prevent him from running again? That's a serious matter, because a lot of that was going on. You'd take the 51 intelligence agents who signed the letter about the Hunter Biden laptop. Well, what was that but election interference? And it was coordinated election interference. How did those 51 people get together? Were they all sitting in a Chinese restaurant randomly one day, and one of them said, "Hey, let's write a letter about the laptop"? Another one said, "Oh, well, I have the laptop right here. Let's all do a forensic examination of it over our tea and fortune cookies," and come to the conclusion that it was Russian disinformation. Well, none of that happened, obviously. Most of those people have no forensic investigatory skills, computer-related or otherwise. So we had a concert of action by these 51 people, and probably people behind them who brought them into this process, maybe who thought it up, which was aimed at, quote-unquote, debunking the validity, legitimacy, authenticity of the Hunter Biden laptop and its contents, of course, which was false, entirely false. The thing was authentic, was not a piece of Russian disinformation. And then putting out this letter, the goal of which was to undermine Trump's ability to function as a candidate for the office of president. And one might ask the question, I don't give you the answer, but I'll ask the question, this was a concert of action to do that, and was that in some sense a conspiracy to deprive Trump of his constitutional right to run for office and to become president? Done under color of law, because some of these people were in official positions, or maybe the people behind them were in official positions. But under the federal statutes we now have, they wouldn't have to be officials. Anyone who conspires to deny someone a constitutional right or civil right under the Constitution can be held criminally liable. So it doesn't matter whether they were or they weren't at the time in public office. And that's a serious crime, 10-year prison sentence. And then, of course, there's RICO, racketeering, influencing corrupt organizations, because you take any group of people and put them together in concert of action for an illegitimate purpose, and you potentially have a RICO enterprise. And it could be, in fact, people in political office. I think it was the governor of Maryland, Governor Marvin Mandel, many years ago, must have been 1980, somewhere way back. He was charged with RICO violations for using the office of governor for corrupt purposes. And they claimed that the office of governor was actually the RICO enterprise that he was using. And you think about that, in the kind of the gangster concept that the law was originally written to address. Right, the legitimate pizzeria that the mob takes over to use for money laundering or, betting, horse betting or whatever, or a mob group all by itself, a mafia family, so-called. Well, that's not a corporation, partnership, trust, or whatever recognized under law. It's just this group of people that have come together to engage in criminal activity. There's another kind of RICO enterprise. So it's certainly possible you could take any of these groups within or outside of the deep state, influenced by the deep state, and say, well, that's a RICO enterprise right there, because they've gotten together, there's a concert of action, and they're engaged in what are called predicate acts. And what are some of the predicate acts? Well, the simplest one that would be involved in the kind of thing I'm talking about is wire fraud, putting out disinformation, misinformation over the internet, right? Television, telephone, what have you, wire fraud. And there are many other predicate acts that probably could be assigned to this scenario. So I would think that would be something he would want to be looking into to make sure this never happens again. Not somebody that had happened to him once or twice or three times, but that the investigatory agencies, the intelligence agencies, the agencies like the Department of Justice, prosecutorial agencies, are never going to be used for these kinds of nefarious political purposes. Or if they are, then the people who have engaged in that kind of activity will suffer severe criminal penalties for doing so. And unless that is made clear, that people doing this kind of thing will suffer severe criminal penalties, then it will go on indefinitely. That's the only way that he clears the situation up. You're in a government agency, or you're someone who's outside a government agency but working, potentially colluding with some within a government agency, and you're going to use that kind of power or influence or platform, whatever it is you have, for these illicit purposes, then you're facing 10 or more years in prison. Very sound idea. RICO penalty is a lot more than 10 years, by the way. But just a simple civil rights violations, conspiracy is 10-year sentence. So that should be done. So we'll see. I don't know. On the one hand, he's coming in with a real mandate this time, which he didn't have the last time. He's coming in, I would think, with much more experience as to what can and will be done against him. This time, I think he's coming in with the experience of having had many of his ideas thwarted because he picked the wrong people. He was given the wrong advice in terms of, personnel to line up for his administration, and that came back to haunt him. Sessions, the first Attorney General, later Barr, Attorney General. He put in Christopher Wray as the head of the FBI. Think about some of these people that Trump himself proposed, signed off on at least. Who gave him that advice? He certainly didn't think that up himself. I would hope that he'd be more attuned to the problematic nature of advice he's getting from some of these professional politicians. Now, he did leave out Nikki Haley. That's good. He left out Pompeo. That's good. So, but of course, they were people who were, what should I say, volubly opposed to him at one point or another. So they kind of had exposed their animosity. So big deal. I mean, he saw what was obvious to him. He has to see what is not obvious to him, and I don't know how exactly how he's going to do that. There's a difficulty. Who are the advisors that are going to advise him against the people who are advising him? You know what I mean?
You mentioned how the Hunter Biden laptop story and how really the censorship or shadow banning of that, labeling it Russian disinformation, that could have actually changed the outcome of the 2020 election, Trump has also talked about really cracking down on censorship and potentially preventing anyone from labeling domestic speech as misinformation or disinformation. Your perspective on that, do you think Trump will have any success in that area?
Well, of course, the first problem is as soon as you get into that area, there's a First Amendment difficulty on both sides, right? Government censorship or people in the government saying what shouldn't be censored on what ground, because, of course, they have to define what misinformation or disinformation might be. So you're always getting back to the problem of you're going to have somebody in public office, some bureaucrat or elected official, sticking his finger on those First Amendment scales one way or the other. Can Trump do it? Well, probably yes, because he has authority over all of the executive branch agencies. And they're the ones that are either directly, because they're coming out with policies related to what they're claiming to be misinformation or disinformation, or indirectly because they're leaking to anti-Trump personalities in the mass media. So I think he can control. He can certainly control the concept of, say, the FBI going to, as it was proven, right? The FBI going to Facebook or Instagram, or wherever they were going, try and influence the monitoring policies or fact-checking policies or whatever. You remember the testimony of what's his name there, the head of Facebook, Zuckerberg, where he was pretty much caught out on the fact that, oh yes, the FBI was talking to them about not doing this or doing that. Matt Taibbi's testimony, for instance, all of that business. So there are things Trump could do, and I think he just has to be careful that he's working in a manner that is purer than Caesar's wife, if you know what I mean, with respect to the First Amendment. You don't want there to be some implication of what he's doing that he himself is taking, or whatever his executive order is, would be taking sides in terms of what is or is not misinformation. I mean, I can't remember the Supreme Court case of Robert, the Welch case, in Gertz versus Robert Welch, Supreme Court case, where the opinion says there's no such thing as a false idea under the First Amendment. That the whole purpose of free speech is to test the validity of ideas by competition and discussion with other ideas or about other ideas. That there are no inherent concepts of censorship that are consistent with the First Amendment. So there's your difficulty in both ways. But the thing about the executive agencies is that, well, they really don't have any authority to speak on behalf, or an individual in those agencies doesn't have any authority to make statements on behalf of the government. I mean, Trump could censor them entirely, say, well, you have to speak to anybody in the media. You're not to make any statements unless you come before a publication board that he sets up. Public statements from any agency first have to be passed by a publication board. Those people have no free speech in the sense that the average American does. For speaking on behalf of the government, they're all subsidiary. Just like someone in an ordinary corporation, Board of Governors and CEO could certainly come up with a policy saying, well, employees are not entitled to make statements about corporate policy, period. If you do, you'll be fired. You have no First Amendment right to be speaking about, as if you were a spokesman for corporate policy or government policy. But it's a fine line that he has to walk. I mean, he's walking kind of on the edge of a razor, right? With respect to that, because he doesn't want to tip one way or the other. He'll certainly be criticized and probably be rightly criticized. But that's another area that he has to look to. And he actually has to look to that internally, because the deep state apparatus is going to be feeding him misinformation and disinformation constantly. It always struck me that was the whole goal of setting up the CIA, but the people really behind the CIA was they knew if they were the source, not simply of raw intelligence, but of the interpretation of the raw intelligence. And even better than that, the selection of the raw intelligence was going to be allowed to be seen by upper levels in the government, along with the interpretation of that selected raw intelligence, then they would actually become the policymakers. Because policy depends upon information. You control the information, that will tend to control the policy. And that was a great danger of setting anything up like the Central Intelligence Agency, leaving aside all of its, black operations and, spook activities that began engaging in. And Truman himself said that he was, I don't use the word shocked, I can't remember exactly how he put it, but that he had never anticipated when he signed the legislation that the CIA would ever engage in that kind of activity. Well, Truman was naive. It's exactly what the CIA was intended to engage in, internationally and domestically. But there's one of your problems. Who is going to be in control of that agency, such as Tulsi Gabbard, who's supposed to be in control of all of them as Director of National Intelligence, that will get a handle on that flow of information, the collection of information, the sorting out of information, raw intelligence, turning that into some selected digest of what the agency believes is more or less credible to what level of acceptance, and then passing that on to wherever they pass it on, whatever channels they use, for the purpose of, in their own minds, for the purpose of affecting policy. The real intelligence agency doesn't affect policy. It says, this is what we found. You people at the upper level, and we think this is more credible than this, or what have you, and now you're going to make the policies to how, as a result of this information, the United States operates in the international realm, let's say. But we're not going to give you, because we're not authorized, or perhaps not competent, to give you more information here in terms of judgment of how this, of what we've developed, should be applied to making a policy. And that's the difficulty. That's exactly what they do. And in many instances, you can't tell. Right? Here's the information. Oh, you give them this information as opposed to some other information that's in the back room, because you know this information will lead to this policy, as opposed to the information in the back room leading to another policy. Is that why you're doing it? And the answer is yes. Of course, that's why they're doing it. Oh, that's why they'll be doing it with him. And he has to be able to control that in some way. Well, that means you get deeper and deeper and deeper into the organization to ferret out the people who are doing that. I mean, you go back into the period of 1950s, with the exposure of Burgess and McLean and Kim Philby and a whole bunch of others, mostly the English spies coming out of the 1930s, the Cambridge spy ring, how those people had infiltrated their way into the highest levels of British intelligence. And then they were, of course, connected with American intelligence as a result of World War II, and the extent to which they did damage here as well. And how were they found out? Well, years after they had done this damage, somebody was piecing together this piece and that piece and that piece, and they discovered, oh, well, it all tied back to Philby, or it all tied back to Burgess, or whomever. Blunt, who was so high up in the English aristocratic system that he was the surveyor of the Queen's pictures. He's an art historian. He's also a Soviet spy. Think of those types of situations. Well, how many of those types of people, not necessarily Soviet spies, but disloyal individuals have their own agenda, put it that way, ensconced in these intelligence agencies. And then the people that they have promoted to higher levels, right? They're the person to give a positive endorsement to some lower level individual to move him up the ladder. So you think about how you're going to unravel that problem. Oh, you're going to look at a lot of dossiers, I guess. You're going to look at a lot of personnel files, clean that mess up. That's really the Augean stables, to use the classical analogy. Tulsi Gabbard ready to get into that? Is she going to put a team together that will start doing that in the potentially egregious situations that we already know about? I don't know. But if I were the president, that's what I'd be thinking of. Look at these agencies here. They've been here for how long? How infiltrated are they? We know what they've done. to him earlier, how are we going to clean these people? How can we depend upon them? The answer is we can't. So we have to clean them up. How are we going to do that? Well, we don't know. We better figure that out. You have what now? 30 days, 30, 50 days, 60 days before he's inaugurated. So somebody has to be on top of that. Hopefully, one would think Tulsi Gabbard is going to be on top of that right now. Although her difficulty, of course, is she can't get into the files in any of the agencies, including the DNI, her own personal office, because she hasn't been confirmed yet. But she better start thinking about it. She better start talking about people who have personal experience of how that system works. You know where to start looking. It's a mess. That's the short answer to it. And the thing is, the people who voted for him, I think they all have short fuses. I think they'll be impatient. They'll want results. And one of the results they'll want, because the immigration problem is one, but even bigger than that is the economic problem. And I don't know. I don't think they understand that if the price of bread is now $4.50 a loaf, putting him in is not going to bring it down to $2. That price is the result of the increase in the money supply. And that increase in the money supply has happened. It's over. It's not going to change. You're not going to reduce the money supply drastically so that you have a deflationary event and prices come down. What you're going to hope is that the economy booms in the sense that people have newer or better jobs, higher real incomes, productivity increase, et cetera, and therefore, yes, they can afford to pay $4.50 for a loaf of bread. But he's got to come up with some answers to that, because that affects everybody every day. And I don't know what he's been saying about that other than what? Well, tariffs. He's been talking about tariffs, but that's supposedly to increase American employment. And there are a lot of people who be fighting him on that one. So I think he has a lot of problems. I wouldn't want to be put in that position. Thank you very much.
Definitely. And when it comes to what the average person can do, I mean, I think it's important, as I've stated many times before, that we shouldn't put our faith in one person, right? So there seems to be a lot of potential positives that could come from this administration. But as you mentioned, there are a lot of hurdles he has to go over before that happens. So if people are, financially concerned, I know precious metals is one option that, you've talked about quite a bit. But what are some ways that people can take their liberty back, in your view, given the situation?
Well, number one, at the federal level, you're going to have to look to how amenable Congress is to putting into practice the Trump administration program, because some of that has to be done by statute. And this idea of executive orders are always dependent upon some kind of a statute. So he has problems that will necessitate statutory reform by Congress. And that means you have to watch very carefully, local people have to watch very carefully what their own representatives and senators are doing, because they will have one more opportunity to correct that in the next congressional elections, right? That was the problem with Trump in his first administration. He never really gained a sufficient majority in Congress, both houses of Congress, to be able to put through some of the more, I won't call them radical, but more thoroughgoing reforms that he needed to put in. So that's number one. Then number two, obviously at the local level, because a great deal of the problems you have are really local problems, whether they're education, whether they're things such as law enforcement? Who are the district attorneys? And those are people that are elected typically in a county or a city. So they're always local officials. And then that ties you back into the state legislature and the state governor, state executive. Ultimately, it's control at the local level, because one would hope that the Trump administration would wind down to some extent federal involvement, intervention of one kind or another, and leave that to the states. And then the question becomes, well, how is your state government going to deal with these problems? I mean, ultimately, local control is the essence of the federal system. You want as much local control as possible, and only those matters that cannot possibly be dealt with at the local level do you go to the state level, or from the state level up to the federal level. And what we've come upon is exactly the opposite. The whole system we turn upside down with this concept that federal spending can be tied to federal regulation of any sort. And of course, state governments are perfectly willing to con their people into believing that federal spending comes out of some cornucopia in the sky that isn't tied back to local taxes, local expenditures, local inflation, whatever, that the financial burden is not ultimately on the average individual. Federal government does not create money out of nothing and have no effect on anybody else other than they can spend it. So there's one of your problems. And then another problem, of course, is the recognition that the educational system, which is leaving aside federal intervention through spending in the Department of Education, the educational system is one of the main problems that we have. People are simply not educated in what kind of a government we're supposed to have, how it's supposed to run, how it's supposed to be controlled ultimately by the people themselves. All of that knowledge of the Constitution, is that taught in the typical upper levels of elementary school or high school? Probably not. Maybe they may mention there's such a thing. And there's a Congress and there's a president, there's a court, and that's it. We don't get into the so-called minutia of what the actual powers or especially the limitations on the government are, and that has to be corrected. Because without that, and you see, what's fascinating is it's gotten so bad. Take Trump as an example, or Biden, or whomever. We have a system that really is Führerism now. This leader figure, whoever he may be, and he has this wonderful program and these wonderful assistants, Goebbels and Goering and Himmler and whoever it may be, right? And when he gets in, he's going to exercise all of these powers, even emergency powers, to solve our problems and to make our lives better. Well, is that the actual position of the President of the United States under the Constitution? No, it is not. That's certainly not the powers of Congress under the Constitution or the court system, right? But people believe in this. So Trump is going to do this. Trump is going to do that. What do you mean Trump is going to do that? Where's his authority to do that? Even if there's some statute, is that statute valid? That's what people should be thinking. When these politicians make these airy promises, especially at the Führer level, the leader figure, and I'm talking not just about Trump. We go back to all of these, all the way back to Roosevelt and maybe beyond. Certainly Franklin Roosevelt was one of these figures. He was going to solve it personally. He was going to solve all these problems. And Congress gave him a lot of excessive powers that were not constitutional. He fouled everything up. And we're still living with the foul up that he created. So this is one of our major problems, is we're looking at this, whoever it is, not just Trump or Biden, anyone in that position running for that office and making all of these pronouncements and promises based on what? The first question should be, you said you're going to do this. Where's the constitutional authority for you to do that? Point to that. Point to the provision of the Constitution which says you can do that. Well, you can't do that. Oh, there's a statute that says you can do that? Is that constitutional? Let's take a look at the powers of Congress. Oh, my goodness, it's not constitutional there either. Well, it's an emergency. I mean, you get these arguments that tend to show that the politicians don't know, their rear ends from a can of Shinola, if I may be blunt about it. They just exercise. I'm going to exercise power because I think it's a good idea. And you're giving me a blank check, you the electorate. And a lot of that was in this election. Right? Trump is going to make America great again. That's a wonderful idea. How's he going to do that? What is the essence of American greatness, at least domestically? It's this particular political structure that we have that enables people to lead certain kinds of lives in security, political security, economic security, financial security, what have you, without being constantly subject to intervention or worse from political and bureaucratic figures, in shadowy office buildings in Washington, D.C., or Richmond, Virginia, for that matter. That's the system. Well, that's the system that they have done workarounds at every one of these political levels. They have to stop that, whether it's a school board, whether it's your local county government, whether it's your state government, or ultimately whether it's this Leviathan in Washington, D.C. And the whole agency concept. I mean, that's one of the clearest things in my mind, coming from the Roosevelt era originally, creating this deep state as huge institutional structure that now has such control over so many aspects of the actual functioning of the government in Washington that, well, according to many pundits, it can't be dislodged. It can only be ameliorated or have its efficiency increased, or that's the Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy approach, I think. Oh, well, we can't get rid of it, but we can make it more efficient. We can make it less costly, or maybe we can make it more responsive to what? To the Fuhrer. They never say that. They never say it clearly, but responsive to whom? By hypothesis, the executive agencies are responsible to the executive, not directly to the people. They're not responsible to the people in the same way Congress is, because we don't elect any of those bureaucrats. So as soon as you start talking about responsibility, well, you're saying, well, you're making it more efficient for this one figure, whether he's good or bad as a personality, to run these agencies. Well, you don't want the agencies to be independent, obviously, but on the other hand, you don't want them to be using their excessive power to build up a greater ability in this Fuhrer figure to do whatever he wants to do. And that's why I come back to the real point is that it's not efficiency of the agencies, it's elimination of the agencies that we want to have happen. We want to roll this thing back in that sense. Every one of those things that isn't initially absolute, start off with absolute necessity. Is it absolutely necessary? No, it goes. And then we'll work our way down. And eventually it'll be recognized, well, there's a constitutional problem here. And that really has to be brought out more and more. That the whole agency structure is fundamentally unconstitutional because it's fundamentally non-representative. The concept going back to pre-Woodrow Wilson was intellectuals, political intellectuals, if you will, said, look, the United States government system doesn't really work because democracy is a sham. The average person doesn't know enough even to vote intelligently. So what we really want to have happen is get people just to vote for Congress and to put people in Congress who understand that even Congress, which is a talking shop, a big committee of dissension and endless debate, we don't want that. Congress has to delegate authority to expert administrative agencies and let those agencies in their areas of expertise run the government and ultimately run the economy, because those people know what they're doing. And Congress's role will be to create those agencies, give them broad powers, and fund them, increasingly fund them, make them bigger and bigger and bigger as our society becomes more complex. And the role of the people will simply be to elect members of Congress who will do that by making whatever promises politicians make. And the role of the executive will be kind of a titular head of this kind of thing. And the courts will rubber stamp primarily what the agencies do on the theory that the agencies have expertise, and that's why the courts really can't interfere with what they're doing, because judges don't have that set of qualifications. And of course, if that were true, then we wouldn't have courts at all, right? We need courts. We have expert opinions testifying in court cases every day of the year, well, except the holidays, I guess. So expertise doesn't mean that you can eliminate judicial scrutiny over public activity, or private cases for that matter. Litigation between corporations over issues that require expert testimony. But anyway, that situation has been created. And it's obvious that once that has been created, real decision-making flows away from Congress, even away from the Vieira, to these agencies. And who are these people? Well, they're appointed initially at the upper levels, and then otherwise they're hired in civil service. Right? They're very difficult to ever get rid of them. And they develop their own agenda, their own preferred policies, and put them into effect through their own interpretation of statutes, their own creation of regulations and interpreting statutes. And I give you just one example, crazy one. The ATF, the BATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, has done some reworking of its regulations based on some language changes that were made in a recent statute of Congress as to who is or who is not engaged in the business of dealing in firearms, who's a firearms dealer, and therefore needs a federal firearms license. And the new regulations are very complicated, and in many instances, they're beyond opaque. And they're being subject to all sorts of litigation right now. But one of them interested me, especially to show you how far they went. They said, well, because they're trying to rope in people who sell firearms as being required to have a federal firearms license, and that would require the sale to go through a background check and so forth and so on. So one of the areas in which they had kind of, I would say, imaginative interpretation was, well, if you have a collection of guns and you sell all your guns at once, as opposed to selling some this month and a few next month or whatever, if you sell all your guns at once, then you will not be treated as a firearms dealer. You won't have to get a license for that. You won't be subject to potentially criminal penalties for selling guns without a license. But if you sell your entire collection, you can never buy another gun. Now, on what theory could that possibly be justified? Just in the statute. Nonsense. In the regulations, they made this up. Constitution with the Second Amendment would say that's impossible. All right? Yes, if you sell all your guns at once, you're not a gun dealer. Maybe you auction them all off, all right? But does that mean that a year later you can't buy another gun? Because you weren't a gun dealer earlier? Is that consistent with it? Just look at that and say, who wrote that? What moron thought he could get away with writing that? Well, he thought he could get away with writing that because, number one, the president would, or number one, the head of the ATF, who was a presidential appointee, was not going to intervene, probably going to approve it. Number two, the president was not going to intervene and throw out the head of the ATF and say this has to be just regulation has to be changed, it's completely invalid. And Congress, what's Congress going to do? Is Congress going to come back and write an amendment to that earlier statute to deal with this particular misinterpretation, gross misinterpretation? Well, Congress doesn't do that kind of thing. Now, the courts may step in and say, well, this is a gross interpretation. I can understand that, but that litigation, well, some of that litigation is going on right now. And talking about years worth of litigation. District court, appeals court, maybe gets to the Supreme Court, maybe not. And then you have to have someone who has standing, someone who sold all his guns and then wants to buy another gun. Well, can he even bring a lawsuit simply on the theory that he wants to buy a gun? Or does he have to buy the gun and then be threatened with the criminal prosecution? It all becomes very, very complicated. So they've created a situation where it's extraordinarily difficult for people to control these mechanisms from the bottom up in terms of electing members of Congress, or perhaps the president, or perhaps going through the judiciary, and that's individuals with particular lawsuits. And of course, they don't control it at all in terms of the personality in those agencies. So you're talking really about non-representative government, and how much of the government is actually the product, in terms of enforcement at least, of the agencies, right? Think of the panoply of these agencies, especially the ones that are spending money with the strings attached. How much of that is entirely the product of what goes on within the four walls of the agency and has very little to do with maybe no congressional oversight or oversight directly by the president, his advisors and his immediate advisors, or ultimately by the courts, because the judicial system is so complicated in terms of having administrative agency decisions or actions reviewed. And that's one of the problems. That's the ultimate problem. And people have to come to the realization that that's our real difficulty here, and no Führer figure is going to solve it. I mean, nibble around the edges, but it's going to have to be a much bigger solution. And I would hope that the Führer figure, Mr. Trump, would begin that educational process.
Definitely. And that's one of the reasons we're here as well, to begin that educational process for our viewers here, Finance and Liberty, so people can know more about their finances and also their own individual liberty, which you have definitely shared with us today. So I did want to ask you, if our viewers are interested in learning more from what they learned today, where can they find you?
Well, they can find my writings in the archive on News with Views, one word, newswithviews.com. And I appear there, I won't say frequently, but every now and then there's a new one. But all of them are archived. If you look up the writers, click on the writers, and you'll get my name somewhere on the list, and you get my archive, everything I've done since, early 2000s. On all of these subjects that we've talked about on your particular show, Dunnigan's show.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely put a link to that in the description of this video, right to your archives page there. Before I let you go, any last thoughts before we leave you, Dr. Vieira?
Well, I would simply say, not necessarily being a superstitious person, but keep one's fingers crossed. This new Trump administration does have real possibilities, and it has obviously a great groundswell of public enthusiasm and support behind it. Let's just hope that he doesn't stumble this time.
Fantastic. We always appreciate your time, Dr. Vieira. Thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for November 18th through November 25th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature backdated 1-ounce silver Austrian Philharmonics at just $3.09 over spot per ounce. We also feature the limited edition 2024 1-ounce gold UK Lion and Eagle coin at just $99 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.